Welcome back. Now, as the African Growth and Opportunity Act's expiration date looms, given the current status quo, it increasingly appears that South Africa may be excluded from the U.S. trade scheme. Can intra-Africa and intra-BRICS trade provide enough cushioning if the country loses out on Agoa? SA BRICS Business Council member Stavros Nicolaou joins us with a BRICS assessment of the country's trade reality. Stavros, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. And I guess that being the million-dollar question, whether BRICS counterparts can provide sufficient support to mitigate the potential losses if Agoa is not renewed.
Firstly, thanks very much for having me. And it's, I guess, of both disappointment and concern that the relationship between the United States and South Africa has deteriorated to the levels that it has. This is probably the lowest point. In fact, it is the lowest point since 1994. And I think we've repeatedly said as a BRICS Business Council that we at all times should look at what is in the best economic interest of our country. And the best economic interest is having a relationship with both the West, the East, and the South. And I think that's a good starting point from which to unpack this conversation. We can't afford, as South Africa, we're a small economy, albeit a vibrant economy at times, which is founded on basic democratic principles. We can't afford to be alienating any one particular geography. We need to attract foreign direct investment and trade from all of these geographies I've just described. Now, what is the impact and can we, if the worst case scenario unfolded and there was an economic impact, and I'm still perhaps one of those optimists that still believes in dialogue, and that if we have a more measured narrative at times and we send the delegations to the US and we're able to better explain and clarify our position on certain things, and if we are seen in the future to be non-partisan, neutral, there's a difference between the two, incidentally. But let's suppose we do all of those things and we're able to recalibrate the relationship. Well, then that's great. I think we need to build from that. But the question remains is, what if there is an economic impact? Should we be looking at East? And I think the answer is very simple there. The answer is we need to continue looking at all the geographies. So even if there wasn't a crisis with the United States, we should in any event be looking to bolster our trade and investment, both with the East and the West. And we should never forget the South, particularly Africa. There's an Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in place. There are many bilateral and multilateral economic partnerships on the African continent, and we shouldn't forget those either. So my simple response here is, crisis or no crisis with the US, we should in any event be looking to act in the best interest, and that means we should build on our partnerships both with the West and the East and the South.
I want to touch on our relationship with the South. You mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement there, which is supposed to be used to boost the intra-Africa trade. Do you think what's currently happening between the US and South Africa sort of presents an opportunity for us to accelerate those efforts, because it has been slow in the implementation process?
The adage of never put a good crisis to waste, right? I think rings true here. And of course, prize one here is that we do repair things with the United States. And I know there are detractors that are saying, well, this horse has bolted, we're unlikely to reclaim it anytime soon. And there are many different scenarios that are playing out in many different boardrooms, both across the Atlantic and here. I'm one of those that believes that there can be mutual synergy between the United States and South Africa. I think that in many respects, we need each other, whether it's we need investment and we need the American multinational companies to continue operating in South Africa, and the US needs our minerals. So I think there is a mutual benefit in the background that should never be forgotten. But never put a crisis to waste. And I think many of us have been disappointed at the pace of the rollout of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. It's no fault of the Free Trade Area Secretariat, I believe. It's more that aligning 54 governments and sort of getting them headed in one direction is no easy task. And very often it is a crisis that comes in and accelerates things. And I'm hoping that's the case here, because we do need to diversify our risk, and we do need to diversify economic partnerships. And Africa has many attractive instruments, including the FTA, by which we can achieve that acceleration. Now, lastly, whilst the immediate anxiety is with South Africa,
yes,
we shouldn't forget that there are other parts of Africa that have already been feeling the impact of some of these executive orders. We know that Africa has the most disproportionate disease health burden of any continent in the world, and PEPFAR and USAID were significant contributors, contributing around $30 billion, the way I understand it, towards healthcare system strengthening on the African continent in various forms and shapes. Now, it's not like the rest of Africa is not going to be unaffected. So if the worst case scenario played out for Africa in health systems disruption and services are disrupted, African governments are also going to have to go in and plug the gap. They can only do that through alternate donors, or they can do it by growing their tax base. And growing their tax base means they've got to grow their economies as well. So it's not just us that are looking to the free trade area for growth, for mutual growth and complementary growth, as we call it, but it's also the rest of the African continent. And this is probably a good time, as the geopolitics rearrange themselves and different and new alliances are forged. It's not a bad time for us as Africans to reflect on ourselves and say, how do we pick up the pace and start trading with each other, start investing with each other? How do we industrialize the continent? That is a key conversation. And just lastly, the biggest benefit I see to the free trade area is that it provides an opportunity to start aggregating the volumes on the continent. And if you get aggregated volumes, then it's your first step to getting economies of scale and industrializing on the continent. And we shouldn't miss out on this opportunity.
Okay, so what's happening really perhaps maybe a way for us to sort of speed out the rollout of intra-Africa trade. Let's bring it back to the BRICS grouping, right? So you mentioned that South Africa is a small economy. Talk to me about perhaps the leveraging power we have when it comes to negotiating deals with the BRICS grouping, you know, to negotiate trade deals that are beneficial for us.
Yeah, look, I think, you know, we're a business council, so we stay clearly out of the crosshairs of the politics, right,
Yes.
and the politicians. And what probably is of probably worth taking note of, and I've mentioned this a number of times, and I'm not the only person that's mentioning this, is that BRICS is an economic opportunity as well. But what's disappointing is that we run a trade deficit certainly with the original 4 BRIC members. So we run a trade deficit with Brazil, India, China, and Russia. And you've got to then evaluate if you're taking political risk in some of these markets and not necessarily getting the correct return, i.e., you're running trade deficits. And I don't have a problem personally with trade deficits. I think they're a reality of life. But what you've got to do is you've got to use those trade deficits to have conversations around how do you grow your export of finished goods, in other words, value add manufactured goods into those 4 BRIC countries. Now, similarly with the expanded BRICS, we run trade deficits with most of those countries as well. So I think the conversation for me should shift to one that says, yes, we have got some leverage. Of course we do. We've got critical minerals and commodities that we have some leverage with on the continent. But how do we better utilize that to even out these trade patterns? You know, one doesn't want to be taking political risk and then it's having an economic impact and your partners are not helping you grow your economy. It calls for a reorientation of that. And as I said, trade deficits are a reality. I mean, I don't expect us to get into a trade surplus with China. It's not going to happen. But you've got to look at the extent of these trade deficits and how can you sit down with your partners and work out some type of an export substitution strategy, so to speak. How do you do that? Where do the complementarities lie? And I believe our government is looking at that, and that's the right way to go. But again, in tandem, as I keep saying, we're a small open economy. We cannot afford to alienate any particular geography or region in the world, and we should be putting equal effort, I believe, in the West, the East, and in particular in the South as well.
Stavros, thanks so much for joining us. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. That was SA BRICS Business Council member Stavros Nicolaou.